means and methods of warfare have killed tens of thousands of people, inflicted vast displacement, and laid waste to the territory. This has raised utmost concerns about compliance with international law. A recent report by my office covering the period between 7 October 2023 and 30 June 2024 documents patterns of attacks on hospitals, starting with Israeli airstrikes, followed by raids by ground troops, that Israel's military operations in North Gaza place the entire Palestinian population of the governorate at risk through death and displacement. For months, we reported intense bombardment on residential buildings, shelters, and medical facilities, displacement orders, the prevention of the entry of aid, attacks on Palestinians trying to flee, and on their shelters once they reached Middle Gaza. Across Gaza, Israeli military operations in and around hospitals and associated combat have had a terrible impact precisely at a time of massive demands on healthcare due to the ongoing conflict. They have been particularly devastating for certain Palestinian civilians. 6 babies have reportedly died of hypothermia in the past few days alone. Women, especially those who are pregnant, have suffered gravely. Many women have given birth with little or no support, increasing risks to both mother and child. My office has been told that newborns have died as a direct result of this lack of care. According to the Ministry of Health of the State of Palestine, more than 100,000 Palestinians have been injured in Gaza. Many of these wounded people have died while awaiting treatment because of lack of access to healthcare. All this is occurring against the backdrop of increased obstacles placed before the United Nations and other humanitarian agencies in bringing aid, including urgent medical supplies, into Gaza and distributing them across the territory. Mr. President, according to the Palestinian Ministry of Health, more than 1,050 medical professionals have been killed in Gaza. It is important to note that medical personnel are civilians who serve a critical function, particularly in wartime. They enjoy special protections under international law. The recent report by my office documents at least 136 strikes on at least 27 hospitals and 12 other medical facilities in Gaza, which caused significant death and injury among doctors, nurses, medical staff, and other civilians, and damaged or destroyed many of the buildings targeted. In the exceptional circumstances when medical personnel, ambulances, and hospitals lose their special protection and are considered military objectives, attacks on them must still comply with the fundamental principles of distinction, proportionality, and precautions in attack. Military operations must always distinguish between military targets and civilians. The use of heavy weapons against hospitals is difficult to reconcile with that principle. Failure to respect these principles is a breach of international humanitarian law. Intentionally directing attacks against hospitals and places where the sick and wounded are treated, provided they are not military objectives, is a war crime. Under certain circumstances, the deliberate destruction of healthcare facilities may amount to a form of collective punishment, which would also constitute a war crime. If committed as part of a widespread or systematic attack on a civilian population, such acts may also amount to crimes against humanity. In most instances, Israel alleges that the hospitals were being improperly used for military purposes by Palestinian armed groups. I've in fact just received a letter from the Israeli ambassador asserting that Kamal Adwan hospital was militarized by Hamas and that Israeli forces took extraordinary measures to protect civilian life while acting on credible intelligence. Yet, Israel has not provided sufficient information to substantiate many of these claims, which are often vague and broad. In some cases, they appear to be contradicted by publicly available information. If these allegations were verified, this would raise serious concerns that Palestinian armed groups were using the presence of civilians intentionally to shield themselves from attack. which would also amount to a war crime. This is why I'm calling for independent, thorough, and transparent investigations into all Israeli attacks on hospitals, healthcare infrastructure, and medical personnel, as well as the alleged misuse of such facilities. Mr. President, I once more warn in the strongest terms about the risk of atrocity crimes being committed in the occupied Palestinian territory. I urge all those with influence to take action accordingly and to protect civilians as a matter of absolute priority. It is essential that there is full accountability for all violations of international humanitarian and human rights law. It is imperative that all parties do everything in their power to stop the fighting in Gaza so that a long-term ceasefire can take hold. All hostages must be released immediately and unconditionally. It is imperative that all those arbitrarily detained are released at once. I call on Israel as the occupying power to ensure and facilitate access to life-saving humanitarian aid, including adequate health care for the Palestinian population. I urge Israel to end its continued presence in the occupied Palestinian territory as rapidly as possible, in line with relevant United Nations resolutions, the advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice, and wider international law. And I call for future recovery and reconstruction efforts to prioritize the restoration of the healthcare system in Gaza. Thank you.
And deeply worrying note, as fighting continues to intensify and hope dwindles for Gazans who have been enduring this nightmare for 14 months. Approximately 7% of the population has been killed or injured since October 2023, with over 25% of the more than 105,000 injured people suffering from life-changing injuries, which will need extensive rehabilitation and lifelong medical assistive technologies, according to WHO and partners' estimates. Time and again, hospitals have become battlegrounds, rendering them out of services and depriving those in need of life-saving care. The health sector is being systematically dismantled and pushed to the breaking point. Its resilience tested amid dire shortages of medical supplies, equipment, and specialized staff. Only 16 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza remain partially functional, with a total bed capacity of just 1,822, far below what is needed to address the overwhelming health crisis. Due to damage, attacks, and shortages, most hospitals can only provide basic care and lack the capacity for specialized treatment of chronic diseases and complex injuries, leading to increased suffering and death. Despite these challenges, the pace of medical evacuations remains extremely slow. Since October 2023, only 5,383 patients have been evacuated abroad for medical treatment, with support from WHO and its partners. Of these, only 436 have been evacuated since the closure of the Rafah crossing of 6th of May 2024, with WHO organized, facilitated by WHO. Over 12,000 people still require medical evacuation, and at the current rate, it would take 5 to 10 years to evacuate all these critical ill patients, including thousands of children. Despite this challenging environment, WHO and partners are doing all they can to keep hospitals and health services operational. However, our ability to move aid is severely compromised. The entry of supplies into and across Gaza remains extremely slow due to restrictions, delays in the clearance of supplies entering the Strip, and obstacles to our missions within Gaza. In 2024 alone, only 111 out of 279, so that's only 40% of WHO missions were facilitated, directly impacting our ability to safely and promptly resupply hospitals, transfer critical patients, and deploy emergency medical teams. Since October 2023, almost every week, WHO has repeatedly issued urgent calls to protect health workers and hospitals as per international humanitarian law, yet these calls remain unheard. Attacks on hospitals persist. To date, WHO has verified 654 attacks on healthcare facilities in Gaza, resulting in 886 fatalities and 1,349 injuries. In North Gaza, which has been under siege for approximately 90 days, the health and humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Only Al-Ada Hospital remains minimal functional, and there are no primary healthcare facilities available in the area. The lack of healthcare poses a severe threat to the lives of thousands of Palestinians still in the area. Kamal Adwan Hospital, the main hospital in North Gaza, was put out of services following a raid last week and relentless attacks since October this year. WHO was constantly hindered in accessing the hospital during this period, with only 10 out of 21 missions partially facilitated. On 27 December, the hospital was emptied. A majority of the patients were forced to a nearby location, while critical patients were transferred to the non-functional Indonesian hospital, which lacks the necessary equipment and supplies to provide adequate care. WHO remains deeply concerned about Dr. Hussam Abu Safia, the director of Kamal Adwan Hospital, who was detained during the raid. We've lost contact with him since and call for his immediate release. Reports indicate that key areas of the hospital were burned and severely damaged during the raid, including laboratory, surgical unit, engineering and maintenance departments, operation theater, and a medical store. WHO and partners' efforts over the last months to sustain the hospital's operations have been undone. We call for urgent access to the hospital to assess the damage and determine if it can be restored. We also urge for facilitation to transfer the medical equipment from Kamal Adwan to Al-Ada and other hospitals in Gaza City. At Indonesian hospital, the situation continues to deteriorate. Although the hospital is out of service, 7 patients, 9 caregivers, and 6 health workers remain there. Today, the hospital reportedly received an order to evacuate and to provide a list of names and details of all those still inside. We urge that the hospital and its remaining patients who are in a dangerous and active conflict zone be protected. The hospital is already severely damaged, and further attacks will make it even harder to restore the facility. Al-Ada, which is the last remaining minimal functional hospital in North Gaza, is struggling to stay open. Hostilities continue around the hospitals, resulting in an influx of injury. 37 inpatients remain inside. Food and water and fuel are depleting fast. The hospital has been without many essential medicines for more than 85 days. Access to the hospital is dangerous for patients in need due to the hostilities nearby. Unfortunately, we have just received reports that Al-Ada 2 has been ordered to fully evacuate. With this, the last health lifeline in North Gaza is at the risk of being severed. WHO is planning a mission to Al-Ada, Kamal Adwan, and Indonesian hospital for assessment. However, currently no roads to Kamal Adwan and Al-Ada are accessible. We urge for access to be facilitated urgently and for evacuation orders to be rescinded. As I close, I want to emphasize that despite the incomprehensible challenges, the health system of Gaza has not collapsed. It's deeply affected and bruised, but against all odds, health workers, WHO and partners have kept services going as much as possible. Al-Shifa, as examples, Al-Shifa and Nasser Medical Complex, which have been restored after being left in ruins, including European Gaza Hospital, following severe attacks, raids and destruction earlier this year, are prime examples of the resilience of a Gaza health system and the inspiring dedication of its health workers, with support of WHO and partners. This is nothing short of a feat and is a reason to be hopeful. It shows what can be achieved if healthcare is protected and peace is given a chance. I want to remind that hospitals have a special protection under international humanitarian law because of their life-saving functions. While hospital may, under specific and limited circumstances lose their protected status, such use does not then absolve any party from its obligations to comply with all other relevant rules of international humanitarian law that are applicable when launching attacks on military objectives, including the principles of distinction, precautions in attack, and proportionality. This remains fully applicable. Lastly, I repeat WHO call to ensure urgently that hospitals in North Gaza can be supported to become functional again, for an expedited pace of medical evacuation, and use all corridors from Gaza to get patients out, including to the West Bank and East Jerusalem, for sustained access to hospitals, for increased flow of aid and information across and goods across Gaza.
Setting an example for all of us of what it means to practice what you preach. I've had the privilege of teaching in Gaza's medical schools and hospitals and getting to know these healthcare workers over many years. Despite being under siege, they were astoundingly able to build an extensive healthcare system, provide high-quality medical care to patients, and nurture excellent medical education for the growing generation of doctors. They are proud, hardworking professionals who take their oath to care for their patients very seriously. Dr. Hammam al-Lawh, when asked why he hadn't left the hospitals when they were besieged, responded, "Who would care for my patients? You think I went to medical school and for my postgraduate degrees for a total of 14 years, so I think about my life and not my patients?" Dr. al-Lawh was killed by an Israeli airstrike on November 12th, 2023, at the age of 36 years. Since October of last year, healthcare workers have become a clear target of Israel's military violence. Our colleagues and friends have been killed, maimed, unlawfully detained, and tortured, he said, and the penalty for saving people's lives has become detention and being tortured to death. I messaged colleagues in Gaza last night to ask what they would like me to say to the chamber today. Here are some of their messages. The savagery continues to get worse. The crimes are beyond brutal, and the world continues to watch. No one is stopping Israel. They do whatever they want without any consequences. There's no such thing as international law, or the law only applies to certain parts of the world and not to us. Double standards, as they say. After 15 months of brutality, it's now clear that our blood is cheap and we're just numbers to the world. End quote. Dr. Khamis El-Assi, a Palestinian pain and rehabilitation doctor in Gaza and a dear friend and fellow Oxford graduate, wrote to me this morning saying, "Yesterday I was working in the emergency department when I was shocked to find my nephews brought in. One was martyred and the other was severely injured. We are devastated. This is my message: stop the war. Enough is enough." End quote. My colleague, Dr. Sara Sakka, who I quoted earlier, and incidentally, who herself works for the UN Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in Gaza, said, "I never thought that international law or human rights institutions would allow this. For 2 million people to be locked in a cage and systematically massacred. Imagine being sick or injured and knowing that the cure is available, but not being able to access it because the crossings are closed. There is no greater injustice." The final set of messages I want to share come from Dr. Hussam Abu Safiyyeh, who my colleague from the WHO just spoke about, the medical director of Kamal Adwan Hospital and a pediatrician like myself. On November 3rd, he wrote, "We urgently need increased pressure on the international community to help the healthcare system perform its duties in accordance with established humanitarian laws. We're not asking for anything beyond this. We are here to provide a humanitarian service to our people, the injured, and those of need of assistance, and we wish to continue doing our job." He then, on December 3rd, after repeated SOS calls in between, said, "Today, for the 5th time, Kamal Adwan Hospital has been targeted in a horrifying, relentless manner. Drones are dropping bombs filled with shrapnel that injure anyone who dares to move. Once again, the occupation is focusing its aggression on medical teams. We are exhausted by the ongoing violence. Why are we subjected to such brutality? Each day, the hospital is systematically targeted. End quote. And what happened next after that? After the Israeli military raided the hospital, people were blindfolded and undressed. Patients on crutches were put on the ground as Israeli soldiers took celebratory pictures with the surviving healthcare workers in humiliating positions. The hospital was burned down, and Dr. Abu Safiya was taken, we believe, along with many colleagues. I speak to you today, like so many healthcare workers and citizens around the world, filled with grief, with anger, with frustration, and frankly, with disbelief. Disbelief that all of our repeated firsthand and utterly damning testimonies have still not moved the world to meaningful action. Disbelief that the countless addresses to the media and even here at the United Nations just 5 weeks ago, we're still here trying to convince anyone who will listen that this needs to stop. Disbelief that all previous propositions to end violence have been obstructed by the very body whose primary responsibility is supposedly to maintain international peace and security. In disbelief that on November 20th, the United States and my country of citizenship again vetoed a UN Security draft resolution that demanded an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in Gaza, despite 14 votes in favor. In disbelief that it has been one entire year this month since the International Court of Justice issued provisional measures after ruling that Israel's acts could amount to plausible genocide. And that since Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, amongst other organizations, have concluded that Israel's actions are consistent with genocide. In disbelief that we are still here after we have driven 96% of Gaza's children to believe their death is imminent, while many wish for their own death. And after 7 infants, as of yesterday, have died from hypothermia in the past week, meaning they literally